Hello and welcome to another episode of the B2B Leadership Podcast. My name is Nils Vinje, and today my guest is Patrick Mirza. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Nils.
Hey, Patrick, I'm super excited to dig into all things leadership, but first, would you share with me and our audience the role that you're in today and the company that you work for?
Sure, absolutely. I'm the Director of Content Marketing and Publications for WorldatWork. WorldatWork is a nonprofit that focuses on helping individuals and organizations develop total rewards in a way that's strategic and effective. Total rewards is pretty much anything that an employee might receive from the organization. So certainly compensation, both base compensation and incentive compensation, bonuses, stock options, that kind of thing. But also some of the other sort of more ancillary benefits you might think of. So it does get into things like wellness benefits. It gets into areas such as diversity and inclusion, pay equity, making sure that everyone's paid equitably. So it really starts with total rewards, but total rewards is a way to attract, motivate, and retain people, and it has a huge impact on your culture. And so it gets into all those areas, making sure that you are creating a culture where people feel included and where they want to do their best work.
Wow, that's fascinating. Sounds like some incredible work that you are doing there. Tell me a little bit about the DE&I side. Recently, I had a guest on the show who is a DE&I expert, Jackie Ferguson, and we had a wonderful conversation about inclusive leadership and kind of bringing that table. But how does the total reward side play into the DE&I piece? There's issues about, are you applying your benefits to everybody? So if you have paternal leave, is it available to both parents if there are two parents involved? It does get into what benefits you're offering, because sometimes a company may not think to offer a benefit that has greater applicability or greater utility for one group of employees than another. And certainly it gets into things like pay equity. Are these things being applied in an equitable manner? And sometimes that can be, an intentional mistake that a company will make. And a lot of times it's an unintentional mistake. Something gets misapplied, and they may not realize that there's this unintended consequence, and that some groups aren't getting the same benefit that others are getting, or the same pay. And okay, so in those kind of situations, in your experience and what you've seen working at WorldatWork, where do those unintended consequences, how do they get brought to the surface? Are these things where like individuals bring them to the attention of the organization, or are these things that you find in like doing an audit, for example, for one of your customers?
So we don't really do the audits. Other people will do the audits, but there are pay audits that you can do. And I've covered the workplace for a really long time, and there are a lot of ways to sort of look at the benefits that you offer and the pay that you offer. And the worst one is when someone files a suit and says, we've done all this research, we've crunched the numbers, and we've found that when you look at the data, some people are not getting the same benefit, the same treatment that other people are. And so there can be unintended consequences to what you do. And there's a real incentive for the organization to do that proactively, certainly to avoid any legal claims, but more importantly, potentially to make sure that you're creating a consistent message and that you are really incenting and motivating people. That's why you offer pay and benefits. And so if you're misapplying that, then you're missing a huge opportunity, and there's a huge expense there that's not giving you the benefit you're looking for.
Love it. Yeah. And having complete, transparency and just clarity and certainty that you are providing the incentive to motivate people in the same way, regardless of background, regardless of stature, regardless of whatever those things are. Very important.
Yeah. And there's increasingly state and local laws that deal with things like pay transparency and whether or not you are required to put a pay range when you put a job online, when you list a job. So there is sort of this groundswell of attention that's being paid to these things.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, we could probably talk for a long time just about all the nuances that go on in your work, but let's shift gears a little bit. And Patrick, would you share with us, how did you get into your very first leadership position?
I guess my first leadership position, if you think of it as managing people, that was one role, but sort of the role before that was my first job out of college. And I was working at a trade association, and I ended up managing the print budget for the organization. That was a long time ago. It was $250,000. So it was even more than it is now. And managing freelancers. And
I certainly learned some things in terms of managing those people. Most of them were older than I was. And there were a lot of changes that we're making in the organization, a lot of improvements. And so you want to try and bring people along with you. You want them to be part of the change. And that's what we try to do.
Okay, so in that case, you're fresh out of college. All of a sudden, now you're responsible for the delivery of things through freelancers, multiple there. What were some of the biggest challenges that you faced? Because it's not terribly different from being technically in a people leadership position, because these people didn't directly work for you, but they were responsible for producing things for you and for the organization. What were some of the challenges that you faced in working with that group?
It is a little different group. I learned later on from another boss some tips that were super helpful, and that when you work with a freelance crew, that you need to take their needs into consideration, and that's true for anybody. But for a freelance group, their needs are going to be potentially a little bit different. And so one of the things I learned later on was that it's really important to time's money for that group in particular, because they're being paid for the job. They're not being paid by the hour. So if you can give them a job with especially good clarity, with good instruction, if you can help them get started, they value that. And what I found was that there were a lot of people who came back to, over the years that I've worked with who were freelancers, who would come back and say, I could make more per hour working for this other organization, but it ends up costing me more time. And so it's not worth it to me. So in some cases, I had someone who was working, for me, who was making $1 an hour and was making $2 an hour at a very reputable, very large newspaper. And she said, look, it's so much work to deal with all the things they require. They pay on publication, not on delivery of the content, which is important for these people. They're living, they don't have a regular source of income. And for a lot of them, being able to provide something where they had clarity and they knew what to do and hit the ground running, that was huge for them. So that was important to know. And a lot of that applies to staff too, right? If you are clear and they know what to do, that's a huge start for them.
Well, okay, so I'm glad you drew that parallel, because I was seeing the same thing there with regards to having clarity and hitting the ground running. What was, from a mindset perspective, knowing that you had this audience that sincerely appreciated that, and it was significant to their livelihood too. How did you take those principles and bring them into like the people you work with internally, who are on salary, who are not, on the same kind of demands and schedules that the freelancers were? But it seems like there's an awful lot of overlap, and that the internal folks would benefit just as much from being treated like a freelancer. Is that fair?
There are some similarities, right? There are differences, obviously, but I think that concept of just trying to understand the person you're working with and how do they approach work, and what are the things that motivate them. That to me, it was so helpful to have to work for someone who had been a freelancer and who could explain to me that mindset. But in terms of managing people internally, everybody has been an internal employee at some point. I think there are very few people who haven't. And so we've all had those experiences. And so part of it is applying what you've learned and thinking about how you've been treated. In some cases, in a lot of cases, I've, over the course of a career that's, has spanned a fairly long time at this point, I've had a lot of bosses. Some of them were great. Some of them weren't great. Early on, I had some that were not so great. And I've learned a lot of lessons from people who did things that I look back and I said, actually in the moment as they were happening, I realized I don't want to be treated this way. When I get the chance to manage people, I'm not going to manage people this way. And one of those happened early on in my first job. I was dealing with a freelancer who was creating a project for us. And my boss kept coming to me and saying, where is this? Applying a lot of pressure to me. And I didn't particularly like the way he was applying the pressure to me, and I didn't turn around and apply that to her. And it came down to this project was due, and I called her up and I said, I'm just checking on this. And I could tell she was panicked. She was running late with a bunch of other things. And I said, look, I'm not calling to pressure you. I live near where you work. I could stop by on my way home from lunch, which would have been a couple hours after it was due. So I'm basically saying to her, you have a little extra time. And I could just hear the sigh of relief. And when I picked it up, she was very, very appreciative. And the whole thing in my mind was you want people to want to work with you. And so you want to create a situation where there's a good enough experience that when you call the next time, or if they work for you directly, they want to work with you. You want people to want to do the job. You can't replace that desire. And so you want to create a good situation and a good relationship.
100%. That's such a wonderful story. In that example, okay, so what was the turning point for you? Obviously, you said that your boss was putting pressure on you, and you instinctively knew that wasn't how you wanted to, how you wanted to come across to this freelancer. Like, what was it that stuck out in your mind that allowed you to, shield what your boss was trying to do to you and just show up in a completely different way to this freelancer?
It was instinctive, I guess, for me. And part of it, hopefully some empathy. I think empathy is something that is key to just any relationship, but especially as relationships in the workplace. It's really easy, from what I've seen, for someone who's in charge of somebody else to just say, do this, and not to particularly care about how they feel or how they're doing it. Being able to say, okay, what is it like to be that person, and do I want to be treated that way? To me, it was instinctive. Probably it was easier because, honestly, the way that person, my boss, treated me, honestly, diminished my respect for him. And so it was probably easier to say, okay, I don't particularly care for how you treat me, and it's much easier for me to say, okay, I'm not going to behave the way you behave. I'm going to follow sort of my own standards and my own ethics in this situation.
No, that's wonderful. And isn't it fascinating that, your boss was reacting to a deadline and whatever pressures were being placed on him at the time, and he just passed it on down the chain, right? Because he probably thought at the moment he was doing the right thing. I have to drive Patrick. I got to make sure we get this done. It has to be delivered, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's it. Just completely forgot about the fact that there's another human being on the other side of this. And I think I see in the example you shared how you showed that there is another human being on the side, and the difference between what is on the receiving end when you're getting it from your boss, and what is on the receiving end when you did it and approached it with the freelancer the way you did. And that's wonderful. It's a great reminder of just how important having empathy is, and to understand, as you said before, how other people see their work, how they value their work, right? There's an endless amount of ways that people look at the work that they do. And as leaders, we had to figure out what is going to be most important to this person, because it's not the same thing as everybody, right?
Right, and whatever you do today is creating the framework for what happens tomorrow. And if you're working on creating some sort of relationship, then you've got a chance to address any sort of missteps or misunderstandings. If you're just going to sort of yell at people and tell them to do things, that doesn't create a good channel. They're not going to tell you when you've made a mistake. Right. Why would they take that chance?
Yeah, 100%. And the difference in, I imagine you probably worked with that freelancer again, and that freelancer was probably glad to work with you because you treated them as a human being, as opposed to just, well, I pay you for a result, I expect a result, and it's black and white and there's no gray area, right? And I think that mindset, is just even though it's a freelancer and it's somebody outside of the organization and you are transacting a product or a result for some money, it creates this kind of different approach. But when you look at the internals, it's exactly the same. We got to deal with it in the exact same way. So this just highlights how important that is to really have empathy and understand that everybody works in a different way. You got to set up what you want to have happen in the future. Do you want a line of people to go out the door waiting to work with you again? Or do you want that to be like crickets when you exit the organization and get hired somewhere else? And it's like, well, now I got to start the whole building process over again.
Right. And to recognize that the motivators, we all have motivators in common, but some people might be motivated more by one thing than another, and they might be more motivated by one thing more than another at a certain time.
Yeah.
So at a certain time, today I might care more about getting money, but tomorrow I might be stressed for time and I might care more about time. And so if you've got that sort of dialogue, then you can understand what motivates somebody today and you can adjust as needed.
Yeah, 100%. And that's great. And I think the example of what you shared earlier with some of the work you do with WorldatWork ties directly into that. Like, what is, from a compensation perspective, there are lots of different ways we get compensated, but what is important to you today and what's important to you tomorrow? And how can I, as a leader, make sure that I understand that so that I line up with, how I show up and how the work you do shows up to ultimately get the best output. One of my favorite quotes is that everybody is motivated to do something. They just may not be motivated to do what you want them to do. Right? And if you understand that, and if you fully embrace that, then you can determine and figure out, well, what is going to motivate you and how does that apply to the work that we need to get done? And it's kind of like, fitting the pieces of the puzzle together as opposed to just saying, here's what we got to do. Go get it done. I'm done. I'm going to go sit in my chair.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I like this metaphor a lot. I've used it a few times. You're familiar with the term "a loose cannon on deck"?
Yes.
Do you know where that comes from?
I do not. I would love to hear.
So back in the days of wooden sailing ships when they had cannons, that the cannons were tied to the side of the ship, and when they would recoil, the rope would stop it, and so you would keep pointing in the right direction. And every once in a while, it would break loose. And now you have this thing that is supposed to be helping you that is now wreaking havoc on your own deck. And so here's this, 2-ton piece of equipment that's rolling around and crushing people's feet. And so that's, I think there's a parallel there with employees and work is you always want to try and direct them. And if you manage people well and if you give them the right incentives and the right motivation, hopefully they're pointing in the right direction. Mm-hmm. But if they're not, you've got someone who's potentially very motivated and potentially a very good employee who's now completely misdirected. And that could cause a lot of problems.
That's wonderful. That's a great metaphor. You can almost see the pirates going back and forth. Heaven forbid they put the cannonball in there and lit the fuse before it started rolling away. That would be even worse of a situation. Yeah.
Right. Come down to your problems. Yeah.
Right. Okay, so you've been on the freelancer side as well. You've been an employee, you've been a freelancer for many years, and then now you're, back fully employed inside of WorldatWork. So you've seen all sides of this. Now from everything that you've learned and applied from all those different experiences, how has your, approach to leadership evolved over time? And what were some of the most important lessons that you learned that would help our audience, regardless of wherever they are?
Yeah, I think certainly the first one is that that we already touched on. We don't need to go into it in too much more detail, but I'll just sort of recap it. Is that you do want people to want to work for you, and you cannot replace natural incentives and motivation, and trying to create an environment where people want to work. But it also means hiring the people who have that. And at times I made the mistake of hiring people who were very talented, but didn't ask the right questions in the job interview and didn't find out that this is really where they wanted to be. They might have done this for 5 years and been really good at it, but the next thing they want to do is a role that has nothing to do with this. And so that's really important to know. So understanding people's motivation and trying to make sure that you have people on board who do want to do the work, and trying to sort of nurture that motivation. It's key. And to me, I always wanted people who took ownership. You need to feel like this is yours. And one of the most discouraging things someone ever told me was a boss said to me, well, this is not your you don't own this publication. And I remember thinking, well, really? Because for years I've been acting like I own it, and you really didn't have a problem with that. But I understood where he was coming from, and there were some good intentions there, but it also was a discouraging thing to hear.
But so let's look at just that one instance, because there was one statement there, and you worked for this boss for a number of years in this kind of situation. Okay, so you worked for this boss for a number of years. You had been approaching your work from an ownership perspective. This is my publication, regardless of, you didn't own the company, you didn't own all the resources, but you took complete ownership of your role and what you were doing to produce this publication. And then your boss said one phrase about this isn't your publication, and tell us a little bit more about just what the feeling was immediately on the other side of receiving that message.
It was discouraging. It certainly sort of left me feeling hollow after he said it. I could also tell that it was inconsistent because and that's sort of where you have to get at the nuance of dealing with people and managing people is there was a behavior going on that he wanted to address, and I understand that. But the way you address it a lot of times is not by trying to shut it off entirely. It's by channeling it and giving some feedback and saying, okay, you're going and you're generally doing well, but I want you to do this a little bit differently. I think managing highly motivated, good employees is probably one of the most challenging things there is, because there's a lot that can go wrong there, right? This person is doing a lot of things well, and you want them to continue to do well. You just want to refine that performance a little bit. And so it's giving sort of nuanced feedback instead of just bringing his hammer down and saying, all right, stop everything. It's like, well, but I've been doing this for years and you were pretty happy with what I did before. So clearly the answer is not stop everything. Clearly the answer is do something a little bit differently. But then I need to know what that is. And so when you flip the tables, you need to be able to tell somebody else the same thing.
Okay, fascinating. And so if we deconstruct this, and now it's happened previously, so you've had time to reflect and look back at the situation. And if you were in his position and you talked about, nuanced feedback is going to be a better way to refine the changes that need to be made. And it sounds like feedback maybe wasn't present in the most effective way. And it got to this kind of frustration point. Is that along the lines of what happened?
I think it is. And I think, looking back on it, one way to give that feedback a little differently was, to say, I'm a little concerned about you because I was taking some things very personally, because I had invested a great deal of time and energy into what I was working on. And it was my baby, for lack of a better term.
Yeah.
And I could see where if someone had said to me, I understand that you take this personally. I understand that you invest a lot of time and energy into this, that you take ownership, and that's all great. But there is a point where you can go too far with that. And then that starts to affect how you react, how you feel as a person, but it also starts to affect how you interact with other people. And that can cause some unneeded problems, right? And then it's here, let's tweak what you're doing, as opposed to what you're doing is flat out wrong, never do it again.
Right. And so the core underlying piece there is feedback. And this continues to be one of the most fascinating areas for me from a leadership perspective. And it particularly because Harvard did some research that I saw a little while ago that basically asked people, leaders in particular, and their teams, what do you want to do the most and what do you want to do the least? And the things that people wanted the most, I'm sure you won't be surprised by this, is corrective or negative feedback, because they want to grow, they want to learn, they want to improve, they want new skills, et cetera. So they got to know what the corrective negative feedback is. However, you probably won't be surprised by this either. The number one thing people did not want to do was give negative or corrective feedback. Yeah. So you have this situation where the thing that people want the most is actually the thing that people want to do the least, especially leaders. And it ends up in situations like this, where had it been handled in a different way, could have resulted in you feeling completely differently about all the work that you had done up to that point. And so instead of feeling, discouraged and, feeling hollow and this being an inconsistent kind of experience, it could have been an empowering one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great stat. That's a great thing to cite in that study. I'm glad you did that. I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. I think one of the things that it's taken me a while to learn, and that I learn all the time. I'm not going to pretend I'm like some fantastic, perfect leader, perfect manager, any of that. But I think one of the things that I had to learn was, and continue to do so, is that people do want feedback, and that it's okay to give negative feedback, and that when you get constructive feedback, right? And when you give it, it doesn't have to be personal, and you don't have to make it personal. And as long as you don't feel like it's personal, that's a really good start that you can say to somebody shortly after the fact, directly, hey, this happened, and Next time I want you to do it this way. And this is why it causes problems, or it has this effect on revenue, or it has this effect on other people, or whatever it is. These are the consequences of what happened. And next time, just let's try to do it differently. And this is what I want you to try and do. And as long as you're sort of just, I wouldn't say unemotional about it, but as long as if it doesn't seem to you like you're bashing somebody, and if you're not trying to, it's okay. And I think that's something that I struggled with earlier in my career, was understanding that it's not personal, that it is work. You should still have a personal relationship with people, but when you are talking about work, you are talking about work, and that's your job, and that's okay. And I think, to your point, people want to hear that. People want to learn how to get better, and so they'd rather hear that than not hear it.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think you hit the nail on the head, because I've done my own research a little less hardcore sophisticated than Harvard's, but I've talked to hundreds of leaders specifically about the topic of feedback, and asked, I've presented that exact case, and there's a beautiful graph that goes along with this, and presented that case. And I say, what do you think is the reason behind why this graph will probably hold true if you asked virtually any group of leaders in any teams, almost anywhere in the world? And the number one thing, which you hit on, was that it's emotional. Feedback, we tend to make a lot and bring into a lot of emotions. And that is the number one thing I've seen that prevents people from giving the honest and just concrete feedback, is that they're worried about how it will make the other person feel. They're worried about demotivating someone. They're worried about replicating an environment that perhaps they were given some feedback in that was not very helpful. Right. And I've certainly been on the receiving end of that. I know you have too. And that's the last place we want people to be. But that fear and that uncertainty then prevents people from giving feedback. And I find it fascinating, because the number one thing in my recommendation is always around actually removing the emotions from feedback. And I'd be curious for your perspective on this. You said, make it unemotional. And I think that we're saying kind of the same thing here, but my goal is to look at observable facts and strip out the emotion. If we strip out the emotion, it's just a fact. It's not good. It's not bad. It's just a thing that happened. Curious for your thoughts on that.
I think that's good. I think, because I think you can practice the empathy and be sort of take the emotion out at the same time. And I started managing people long before I ever had kids, but I sort of recognized that there was some sort of parallel, and I heard lots of people talk about it. And I think one of the things that brings to mind to me is, when my wife and I have talked to our kids as they've been growing up, we will distinguish between you, the person, and the behavior. So just because the thing you did is not great, it doesn't mean that you're a bad person, that people make mistakes all the time, and people there's unintended consequences. And so bearing that in mind, it's that the person's not bad. It's just the thing that they did in this case is not something that you want them to do again, or there's a way to improve on that. And so I think that's one way to think about that is, I'm not saying that you're bad. I'm just saying that I observed this thing and I'd like to do it differently, and this is why. I think it's important to say that this is why. There's a couple things that makes me think of. I mean, I've been lucky enough to talk to some really smart people over the years and interview them. People I've covered the workplace for almost 30 years. And so I've gotten to interview and talk to people and research. And so there's some really cool stuff. And so have you ever heard of Teresa Amabile from Harvard?
Yes.
So the progress principle, the notion there that the thing that most of us are motivated by is we want to make progress on anything that we're working on. And even small progress is really helpful. And that goes to your point, I think, about feedback is if I can get feedback and find out how I can make better progress or how I can give you more of what you want, that's better. Why wouldn't I want to know about that? Nobody wants to spend their time on bad work or on useless work. And one of the things that really stuck with me was I got to meet Gary Latham at the University of Toronto. And he had this story that in World War II, that in the prisoner of war camps in Nazi Germany, they did these experiments, one of who knows how many, where they would tell the prisoners,
dig a hole on this side of the camp and then put the dirt over there and then do the opposite, right? So you're digging holes and filling them constantly. And a lot of them went crazy, where they're literally like climbing the wire in the broad daylight, knowing they're going to get shot because they can't stand it. They can't do it anymore. And his point was that applies to the workplace. And I think about that so many times. If you send somebody to just do a mindless task, I'm spending my life. I'm spending at least 8 hours a day of my life doing this thing. Why would I do that? Why would I not want to do what Teresa Amabile says and make progress and feel good about what I've done? And I think all of that fits exactly with what you're talking about.
100%, 100%. And that is, it's fascinating. That piece about progress, I think, is so critical to understand as a leader, that it's not always about the big picture. It's not always about achieving the goal at the end of the quarter or the end of the year. Sometimes we hang way too much importance on that. It's about making progress, small, incremental progress, because nobody ever quits. Like, just in terms of engage, I'm not talking quitting their job, but nobody ever quits if they're making progress. And you look at anything in personal life, professional life, from fitness to health to investing to diet to leadership to period. If you're making progress, the world's a way better place to be than if you are doing the same thing over and over, just like in that example you shared. And it has a major impact on us psychologically. So,
yeah. I've seen this situation, and probably you have too, where I've talked to friends of mine and they're in a job where it's not the greatest thing in the world. And I say, why don't you leave? And they say, well, I'm 3/4 of the way through this project and I want to finish it first. And even in a place where it's not great, they're motivated to stay and finish that project because they've invested in it and they want to continue to make the progress until they get to a good stopping point.
Yep. And as long as they find that good stopping point, they'll be in great shape. Sometimes the stopping point can be a little bit of a challenge, which we probably won't go into that here today. That's probably a whole other episode. But it's fascinating, isn't it? Like, we are wired to ultimately continue to make progress. Our bodies, our minds, our entire lives are built around making progress. So when we put ourselves in position, or put those who work for us in a position where they cannot make the level of progress that they think is appropriate, the writing's on the wall. You know exactly what's going to happen. And I think some leaders inadvertently set that up. And it's like, well, here's your job. You do it the same way every day, over and over and over. And maybe once a year we'll revisit how you do it, and then we'll do a performance review. It's like, whew, talk about missing the mark there.
Right. And part of that is we talked about giving feedback to the employee, but part of it is receiving feedback from the employee. Because if you're not listening to what they're saying, then what happens is, you work for me and you're in a situation where there's some bottleneck, there's some roadblock in your job, in the organization that makes it hard for you to do what you do. And I don't talk to you and get regular feedback from you, or I get the feedback and you say, hey, this thing is slowing me down. And I go, talk to so-and-so, or, work around to do the best you can. At some point, the message you've gotten is he doesn't care about the roadblocks. I just need to do the best I can. And so you are actually doing the best work you can given the situation. But I haven't changed the situation to help you do even better work. So that's my fault. That's on me.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. All right, Patrick, wonderful discussion. So much going on here at Feedback. So interesting and wonderful timing, because I just put together a program around specifically how to give feedback. And I got a very simple 3-step system, and I call it the 5-minute feedback makeover. And you can go to b2bleadersacademy.com, and there'll be a header on the top or on that main page that says the 5-minute feedback makeover. It's completely free. I'll walk you step by step through my feedback process for how we strip the emotions out. You understand what's on the line with feedback and how you can become a feedback giving machine to help other people grow, just like Patrick and I have been talking about. So, Patrick, last question here. Let's say you could take a trip back in time and sit down with your younger self, perhaps at that, first pivotal job that you were in, that we talked a little bit about at the beginning, working with the freelancers, and you know everything you know today. What advice would you give your younger self?
It's a really good question. And it may sound backwards, but I would probably say, hey, Patrick, don't kill yourself. There were a lot of times where
when I started my career, the economy was terrible. It took me a long time to get a job. And I recognized that I was a few months away from the next graduating class from my university graduating. And I thought, what's the difference between me and the next 1,000 people who are going to come out with the same degree I had? The only difference is they're a year younger, and nobody's going to look at them and say, why haven't you been working for 8 months? And I guess I felt that for a long time, where I felt like I was a little bit behind the 8 ball, and I needed to establish myself, and I needed to sort of build that career. And so it became having success at work was tied to my success. And I really, I did some things I'm really proud of. But on some level, sometimes that's not worth it. Sometimes the effort you put in, it's just too much. And I remember, that first job, I built all computer systems myself. I did lots of design work. I did lots of computer work. I'd come home and I had such eye strain headaches that they wouldn't go away sometimes until Sunday. Or
in order to start on Monday morning.
Right, just in time to come back. Yeah. And other times where I was just so invested in it that physically it probably wasn't the best thing for me. I wasn't getting any exercise. I wasn't sleeping well. There's a point, that point of diminishing returns, and I guess recognizing when that's happening, and then taking care of yourself. And we talk about sustainability in the workplace. You have to operate yourself in a way that's sustainable. And it's in your best interest, but it's also, honestly, if you want to continue to do a good job, you have to be there, and you have to be well rested and be balanced enough in your own place that you can do good work and interact well with others.
100%. Patrick, that is just absolutely wonderful advice. In my view, I call that a lot of what you just said wrapped up in leading yourself. As if you can't lead yourself and take care of yourself in those situations, it's going to be really, really difficult to lead other people. So thank you for sharing that incredible wisdom. And it has been a blast to spend some time talking leadership, your experiences. We went deep on feedback. And like I said, check out the 5-minute feedback makeover that's available at b2bleadersacademy.com. And I look forward to helping you give some incredible feedback. So Patrick, until we talk again, thanks so much for sharing your insights, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you. It's been great.